In order to take as many questions as possible, we're going to ask folks to line up in the aisle so we can go one right after the other. We've got about 20 minutes or so for questions.
Go ahead, shoot.
Do you want to tell us who you are or where you're from?
Or you can do it anonymously.
No.
Yeah. Well, they can always lie.
Yeah.
All right, oh, this one, good. And I'm interested to know what the solution is, if there is a solution, to cutbacks and to throwing jobs out the door when people aren't buying newspapers in the numbers that they were buying newspapers.
Right. I'll tell you what I think the solution is, and the horror is I don't think they're going to get to it. I think it's too late. But the solution is and was, you have to charge. Any business major will tell you. Do we have any business majors here? No. See, it's talk about marginalizing yourselves. Any business, if you have a product and you can't charge anybody for it, you don't have a product. And ultimately, newspapers didn't make any money on circulation. In fact, they lost money a little bit, some of them, just because of the cost of delivery. But what circulation gave newspapers was the ability to go to an advertiser and say, I got 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people willing to pay for this every day. Pay money for it. Paid circulation. That's why they measure it as paid circulation. Online hits mean nothing. We all know from surfing how fast and inconsequential an online hit is, and how fast you move when you're. There's online advertising is never going to, for unpaid websites is never going to create the same kind of revenue as display advertising in a newspaper. You've already lost the classifieds to Craigslist. There's already a lot of problems. But what has to happen, and what had to happen early on, was that the preeminent newspapers in the country, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, the three best newspapers in the country, had to say, we're charging. We're not going to charge you as much if you want to take the paper online. We'll charge you half as much to take the paper online as to have taken it delivered to your doorstep. But we're going to charge it. So if it's $30 a month to get it to your doorstep, it's $15 to get it online. And they had to make their online services as usable and viable as anything else they did. And in doing so, they would have set the trend for other secondary regional newspapers like the Sun or the Miami Herald or the Philadelphia Inquirer or the San Diego paper or the San Francisco Chronicle, and allowed them to do the same thing. And this would have generated enough revenue, not just from the websites, never mind the websites, it would have generated enough credibility among online advertisers to maintain the revenue flow that would maintain quality news gathering. And instead, everybody mistook the internet for advertising for their product when in fact it was their product. And they gave it away. That stuff can leak, that people can link to stuff, that stuff would get out, of course. Everybody's fighting a rearguard action, everything, the music industry, the publishing industry. But you know what, when Google started to try to publish books on the internet, the publishing industry said, no, we're going to sue the shit out of you. And when Napster was going to download all the music, no, we're going to sue the shit out of you. And it is a rearguard action, but unless you can charge for your product, you can't generate the revenue to continue to achieve your product. And that had to happen. And as long as the New York Times and the Washington Post, which have more resources than these other second-tier papers, as long as they're willing to take the hit, and they are taking a hit, their margins are going down. They're not making money. They're attriting out talent from their newsrooms, but they're still very fat. Well, the Baltimore Sun, when the New York Times goes from 1,200 reporters to 1050 or 1050, what's the percentage loss? It's significant. But when the Baltimore Sun goes from 500 to 300, their margins are a lot worse. and the reflection on the quality of the Baltimore Sun is dramatic. Same as the Minneapolis paper. And so these communities that rely on newspapers for their fundamental news gathering are looking at an abyss. And I don't know if we can get, now that the internet has been free for so long, I don't know that we can get back there. It's going to take, and by the way, it's not as if the New York Times is going to do it if the Washington Post doesn't, because they'll get killed. Everybody's got to take a deep breath and do the same thing. The problem with that is there's a name for it. It's called antitrust. They can't even have a conversation, right? Here's where the lawyers jump in and they're nodding their heads. Oh yeah, it's an antitrust problem.
But in an industry where the whole ethic is to get information out, to tell people what's going on, to tell people your government is ripping you off or something.
It's not PBS. Newspapers have always been for profit. But newspapers have always been for profit. They've always been for profit, and I don't think that's going to change.
But it's not an intellectual
what?
property the way like Napster or something like that. If you have a song.
If it's not intellectual property, then why do journalists keep getting fired for plagiarism?
They don't own the story. They own their presentation of the story.
Well, again, then they own their presentation. If you want to own the story, you send 2 reporters and a photographer to Fallujah. You spend the money to do that. If you, Mr. or Mrs. Blogger, decide you want to own the story about what happened in Fallujah yesterday, you pay to send somebody there. Short of that, there has to be listen, I don't think it can happen anymore. But absent it happening, this is a race to the bottom now. And it's going to be an interesting little democracy we're going to be pretending to when nobody's really covering anything. And the last handful of reporters are chasing down some 5-part project that nobody gives a fuck about so they can win a Pulitzer, so that they, because everybody needs to get to the New York Times, so that whatever the last big pond is where fish can still swim around, I better win something quick. I mean, God help us.
But where are the readers going then? I mean, if readers aren't buying the paper, do you think readers aren't buying papers because
young readers don't buy newspapers? They read online. Mike, I got a 13-year-old kid. He reads online, but he reads the Washington Post online for free. Now, I mean, I think that, that's just anecdotal, but I think it's quite obvious from all the news. Everything I've read on Romanesco is people under 35, don't buy newspapers the way people over 35 do. They read online. Well, newspapers are going to have to control that product, and they're going to need to achieve a financial victory for controlling that product, or they are not in business, or there is no business. I mean, the presumption is we're going to keep diving until finally online advertising catches up with what we're losing in the print edition. But online advertising is never going to pay the kind of rates if it's just a matter of you going to them and saying, "Hey, we had 200,000 hits on our site last week. What's a hit?" Somebody want to pay $10 for that? Oh, well, okay. You have a reader then. You have a hit. What? That's the problem. Yeah.
Hi, Dave. Delaney Dragon. I'm a filmmaker, and my question is along the lines of filmmaking. And looking at what you've accomplished in the last several years on television, I'd certainly put that filmmaking up against the filmmaking of filmmakers as opposed to people doing television, if that makes a difference to you at all. But
there was an insult in there somewhere, but just keep going.
No, not at all. It's
okay. You didn't mean it.
You're the only filmmaker in television that I think a lot of people would put, in that realm with the great filmmakers that are working.
It's all good.
They're all. So, putting you kind of in that group, I'm curious about your development as a filmmaker. It seems like you've spent, most of your life not as a filmmaker, whereas most people who are filmmakers spent most of their life.
I was on the set of Homicide for a year and a half. Not every day, but I would go down for certain episodes where I was on. Before I realized that the guy standing over the camera doing this was focusing it. That's how little I understand about filmmaking, or did. I still can't tell one lens from another. But I did learn shot composition. I learned a lot from Bob Colesbury. And I learned a lot from Tom Fontana. And I learned a lot from other people because it was fun to learn new stuff. But a lot of doing this collaborative thing is knowing how much you don't know.